If you want to know how my next guest took one science class and it led to a world of art and abstraction, keep listening. Hello everyone, I want to welcome you to season 2 of the Hey Baby podcast. In this season, I'm talking to artists, I'm talking to creatives, thought leaders, conversation starters. I want you to look at my conversation with Steve Alexis. My conversation with Steve was full of gems, so I want you to listen very closely to the things that he says and take note of the way that he sees his journey, the way that he gets through his exploration of his craft, and the future that he sees in connecting with the world.
This is the Hey Baby podcast.
Hey y'all, today I have the honor of talking to Steve Alexis. Steve Alexis is a multidisciplinary artist born in Miami, Florida. I'd like to start by first asking you what your first mediums were. Like, what was your first medium that allowed you kind of creative freedom?
Yeah, Ken, thanks for having me on. My first medium, well, I'd say I really first got into art and started considering it as like an actual principal interest of mine was when I was an undergrad. I took my first jewelry class. So we were working with fine silver and copper, and I hadn't really explored metal at all prior to that in such an in-depth way. So I did find myself really drawn to metal, specifically sterling silver, just in the way that there was a noticeable difference between shifting between the molten and the solid states. And at that time, that kind of that shifting between those two stages of matter really kind of drew me in as someone who's kind of just figuring out what they were doing in college and really had no idea what was going on. And I took my first jewelry class and really started working with metal. And at that point, like my draw to materials rather kind of really started with metal and silver.
I noticed that you work with a lot of themes of kind of accessory and adornment. What does that mean to you, and what does that signify just in the way that people consume your art?
Yeah, I think because most of my work really started from the basis of jewelry making and contemporary art jewelry, I always find even my more recent work, which is not necessarily related directly to adornment and body wearing, always seems to signal something back to that origin point of jewelry making and jewelry. I think it's just really because of that, those first kind of pivotal ways of practicing art and seeing the world through an artist's lens started from jewelry making. So yeah, I think that always is like a basis point for my practice going forward. Thinking about how things exist in space, interact with the body, relate to the body, having that basis as a jeweler and thinking about our jewelry as a waypoint through how my practice started and kind of continues to interact with adornment and jewelry. I think that's kind of a way I'd like people to think about it, at least in terms of my practice.
Yeah. I think that's interesting, the relation to the body. Art, I think it's a lot of your metal work carries this kind of tactile, kind of like clay-like movement in hands kind of like thing. And as an adornment, as accessorizing with it, there's no kind of ignoring the fact that somebody worked with this and it's also working with me, right? And so you create a tactile relationship with your consumer or whoever comes in relationship with your art. I think that's really interesting, and I love that. What do you think about that?
No, I really love that phrase that you use, like working with me, in terms of thinking about the work. That's something that I've thought about a lot, even when I've kind of gone in different directions with my practice. Everything that's kind of remained in contact with my hand, I found myself really thinking about this relationship between me as not this sort of classical sculptor who's like really hammering forms into like solid marble, but in the sense that what I'm doing to the work is I'm influencing it or trying to put my influence on the work, and the work in turn is also influencing me as well. So I've always thought of that relationship as this sort of cycle of work influencing the maker, making between the work, and kind of going back and forth in that sense. So yeah, I've always wanted that relationship that felt more of a partnership rather than anything of subservience. Like I never feel like I'm ever proficient enough to say I can do these things in materials. I'm doing what the materials are allowing me to do, and the materials are also having their own sort of input on what my hand
Right.
says as well.
You explore materials. You pick something up and see how you can wield it. I love that. Yeah. You what do you have to say about that? Exploring things that you simply just don't know about. I love this summer I was teaching animation and filmmaking to a group of kindergartners actually through 5th graders, and it was so interesting taking away from that experience because they asked me, how can I do more of this? How can I create more of this? And as a kid, you're like, they're in the rubric of education, in the rubric of what these years look like for them for the next 10 or so years, right? And so my advice to them was really to take up every project, every assignment that you have in school, every medium, every finger paint that you're able to take and do what you want to do with it, right? Fulfill your duty, but also explore that thing within yourself. I think in that way, also, your work opposes this kind of passive gaze. It's hard to see your work and not try to make sense of it. Make sense of it on the person, make sense of it in space. Let's move into a conversation on kind of exhibition and the venues and auxiliaries where you put your work. How do you interact with space and the gaze? And yeah, how do you interact with the space and gaze?
Yeah, well, I think each opportunity to show work, whether you're included into a show, a group show, or you're awarded a solo show, or you're just kind of finding space to put your work out, like you're kind of more guerrilla style, finding kind of artist run DIY spaces, or just like making work out in, the world. There are all kind of different opportunities to do different things. So, I mean, when I have open space, like in terms of the gallery, I really like to spend time in looking at how the spaces exist and where my current practice is at the moment and where I can kind of use the specific space as an opportunity to have another iteration of the work. I think that's something that I've kind of done, which I don't know if it's the best idea. I probably wouldn't recommend it going forward because it makes applying for things difficult a little bit. But I've kind of refused to put specific sizes on the work. I've kind of left everything for the past year for certain pieces as dimensions variable because I kind of believe that some of the work I'm doing now, there is no final form in terms of how it's being accessed by the viewer or exists in space. Each time I have a chance to show the work, it can exist in a different form. And there is no specific dimensions I'd like it to exist in. While certain galleries may not be necessarily as exciting as one may want, there's always specific little cues and areas that you're at that you can play off of. And I like to try to do that to kind of give, the work more legs outside the studio. Because for me, for a while, the work would exist in a certain form in my studio for a while. I'd look at it, and I wasn't taking it outside as much. But as soon as it would leave the studio, I'd get 3 different ways of wanting to show it. And to me, that really spoke to the work still evolving and kind of having its own agency of like how it would like to be displayed or how it like to exist in space. So yeah, I guess whether you're in the white cube or you're kind of just making work out in the world, there's always opportunities to kind of expand what you were doing. So that's kind of how I've been thinking about it recently.
I never thought about how much dimensionality and the rubrics of what we okay, how do I word this? I never thought so much about how dimensions create the rubric of how much we can explore. Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's so much information for the buyer also, right? And so if you can't really provide that information, it creates kind of an oppositional relationship, which is so interesting because then you take so much power as an artist. I like that. Not only over the space, but over how it is consumed, right? How you want people to think about it. How, yeah, yeah. What I love about seeing your jewelry and metalwork is I can't help but also think about what it looks like on me, right? And so I love that kind of relationship when you see something in a gallery or you see something in an exhibition and you think about, okay, what would this look like in my space? What does my appropriation of this thing mean for my lifestyle, for who I am and my identity? How does my identity and the juxtaposition of those things affect the meaning of the art, but also the meaning of my identity, right? How you walk down the street, how you present in public. How much does your art prioritize self-expression as opposed to public consumption? How much do you think about how this thing is going to be consumed as you're creating it?
Yeah, I'm incredibly self-involved. Definitely, I'm in the studio or engaging with art in general, mostly thinking um, through something related to myself. And I kind of admire some people who have specific social practices that kind of, think about the public in a different way. I just, I don't really have the temperament or like the ability currently to kind of do that. So I'm definitely thinking as the work evolves or starts, I'm definitely the first port through which it exists through. And there's no kind of escaping the public. There's definitely going to be an engagement once the work leaves my studio. That's kind of, why artists show work is kind of, you want people to engage with it. Otherwise, there's work that will kind of never leave my gaze and will exist solely for me. But once the work kind of leaves the kind of protection that I have around it, then it's kind of open for kind of public engagement. So I'm definitely thinking through the thoughts that I want to get across, the material that I'm interested in, the conversations I want to have around the work as primary and like the first step into my practice. I'm definitely okay with that. I don't feel strange in any way of having that real self-involved relationship with my practice. I don't think I probably would be an artist if I wasn't thinking that way about my work, because there's probably other things I'd like to do in terms of thinking about the public that may not necessarily be that first medium I would explore that through.
Yeah. I think for neurodivergent minds, I think first thinking about stimulation and how you can self-stimulate and taking away the stigma of doing that in public. I think we can do that a lot through art also. I think the new wave also is being able to create spaces where you can simply be yourself, self-stimulate, create, and draw people into that also. I want to talk about abstraction. You're quoted saying, individual expression rouses societal and technology development. In effect, that same development influences the expression of the individual. And so you have this, we continue to talk about this kind of relationship that you have, not only with the material as you explore it, as it's a new thing, as it's a created thing out of maybe dust, as some would call it, right? But you also keep that understanding that this thing may not be my own one day, right?
Yeah.
You also talked about the things that you keep for yourself, right? Maya Angelou talks about this really interesting topic of that which you keep for yourself, that which you keep pristine. And so I want to dig deeper into like, how do you balance those things?
Yeah, I guess
Yeah.
abstraction for me has kind of just been, well, prior to undergraduate, which is where I really started getting into art, I wasn't really a big art kid. I wasn't doing a whole lot of drawing or
I
sculpture.
love
I
that.
didn't go to an artist high school.
Yeah.
So I was really just discovering art for a real way for the first time. What was I? I was in like second or third year of undergrad. And in a way, abstraction kind of became my default. Like I wasn't approaching it through any necessarily particular lens. It was just how the work was naturally evolving. in a lot of ways, I kind of rejected seeking real structure around it. I wanted to kind of explore things on my own and see how things were developing and happening. And it just happened to be that abstraction kept being that lens of which it was happening through, and kind of thinking about ideas of, or trying to, because when I ever have to voice this idea of like the subconscious or the unconscious mind, it kind of loses its same luster. But the idea of kind of working through a sense of not thinking out actions and really having a different sense of the mind really influence the work that you may necessarily be conscious of, and that kind of different sense of the mind really leading to practice. That really became something I hadn't encountered in any other kind of discipline prior. This sense of this kind of knowing that didn't have access to in any other sense. This way of exploring something with a sort of confidence that I didn't need to have a teacher necessarily behind it, or there weren't necessarily clear answers, but things were happening and I was learning just simply by engaging with things by hand. So it's been years and I still feel the same way whenever I work. I still feel this same kind of newness and freshness and this kind of constant learning just by simply engaging with things with my hands and thinking about different ideas and just a way of looking at the world. I think being an artist is a lot about just looking at the world in a different way. Even if you don't make anything physical, I think just art in and of itself is just a way of thinking and looking at the world. Yeah, my lens just tends to necessarily be through abstraction. So it's kind of how, work seems to feel more comfortable for me and make more sense.
Nina Simone talked about this, and people often quote this quote: "An artist's duty is to reflect the times," right? Mm-hmm. And so it's so interesting how you have to develop kind of that critical mind, but also lose yourself in the exploration of your own art as a exploration of those ideas and a criticism of those ideas, right? I think so much about Basquiat and how people copy his art, copy his style, right? But if you really dig into him, his art was a personal catharsis, and it was a temporal catharsis, right? He had layers of art and layers of thought that he would either expose or cover up. And so, that draws me back to like the part which you keep pristine and the part which you expose. How much of your artistic practice is ritual? How much of it are you still exploring? Or do you feel like you have it down?
Definitely don't have it down. Definitely still figuring it out, like any person out there. But in terms of ritual and that kind of idea, I think every time I'm in a space, because right now I don't have access to the same studio I used to, and we're recording right now. This is like my room, which is also my studio. So just the act of getting whatever material I'm working with and starting to work with it, that to me, that's my ritual. Like right now I'm working with like really thin wooden sheets. So I'm like soaking them with water to make them more malleable. Then I'm like using glues and layering them around themselves. So that act of simply engaging things with my hand, that kind of ritual nature, I find to be that sense of making really starts from just a repetition of acts. Or it's just a way of thinking as well. I kind of mentioned before, like the way of being an artist is seeing and thinking about a world through a different sense. When I find myself with less time these days, or waiting for access for materials, it is putting my mind in the space of thinking about work. While I'm a terrible drawer and I don't like sketching, making myself kind of think out forms that will eventually really get abstracted further from whatever scribble I put down, but putting myself in like a mindset of thinking about forms, or really connecting more temporal ideas, and how do those ideas then impact whatever material that I'm using and kind of, thinking about that relationship. So yeah, I think about ritual in terms of repetitive thought and repetitive action. So that's kind of how I would engage with that.
And do you find that it changes with your material as you explore that material? Do you think of I think of so many people who have okay, I do my art from 2 to 5 p.m. every day. I get up early in the morning. I do 6 to 11 a.m., right?
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that it takes time for you to kind of explore this thing until you feel confident in using it. And so do you hold yourself to those kinds of restrictions? Or do you find that there's ritual in that as well?
If I was a more organized person, maybe I'd have scheduled times for things. But I'm definitely trying to just fit in things in a more kind of chaotic manner. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of stages in terms of me working with material and it existing as an art form. So like right now, when I find myself with this thin wood that I'm using, I'm learning that I'm not as dexterous as I used to be just because of my previous body of work. I was working with larger wooden sculpture and I didn't have to be necessarily gentle in the same way that through this paper, because if I put too much power when I'm handling this wood sheet, it rips instantly.
Mm.
So things like that, discovering the limits of how I'm interacting with this object, what it's telling me it wants. Does it need more water for me to be able to bend it at this angle? Does it need to be more dry before I add more glue? These things like that are really just the kind of, I don't know, it's like early dating a partner. You're still figuring them out. You're learning what they like and how you are wanting to find out more things about them. And then eventually you kind of, you catch a rhythm, catch a speed, and you're starting to kind of meet more at the middle and you're figuring out each other more and you're liking what you're going through. That's kind of where like the form starts to develop more and I get more of an idea of an object. And then once I kind of feel like I'm learning more and I'm not necessarily having to figure out the things that I'm doing to it, like I'm having expectations of what might happen when I bend it or add this amount of water, for example, then I can kind of start to get more loose and, okay, how can I add color? How can I add more dimension? How can I do something different from my last body of work? So it's just a time thing. And I'm someone who is impatient at a fault. So I do like to kind of get to that process as fast as possible. And I think part of my practice is kind of learning, when to speed up, when to slow down. And yeah, when the work is done isn't usually kind of determined by me. Sometimes it's done before I know it, and I have to go back and undo some new things that I did. So it's always a learning process for me.
Are you ever really done?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, that's the big question. And it kind of connects back to that earlier thing we were talking about in terms of dimensionality. I don't feel that I'm done most times. And I do feel that there are arbitrary pauses for a lot of the work that I'm doing. Whether I get more interested by something else, or there's a time restriction in terms of me exhibiting the work or having to do other things. The work exists in moments of time. So I think photography has been a really important part of my practice, is because I can kind of capture these certain moments that the work exists. So when it changes again, I can have kind of record and a memoriam of how it existed once and how it can now exist in the future. But I think everything's on pause for me. Nothing really ends. They're just things that I don't necessarily always go back to, or they're things that I may return to in the future. But I think work always gets paused for me. I never feel like, oh, this is done. I just have something else in my mind usually.
Have you always been comfortable with those kinds of pauses? Yeah, there's so much, I feel like, stigma, especially in our world that emphasizes work and emphasizes schedule and efficiency. Have you always been comfortable with the necessary pauses, the natural pauses?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I'm confident in my engagement with my practice. I make a lot of work and I enjoy making that work. So I'm never gonna feel a lack thereof of production in the studio unless there's some extraneous circumstances that's really kind of consuming me mentally or physically or my time. So I know I'm always gonna get to it. Like something's gonna get done. It's just getting outside of the studio and having an interface with the world is a really big thing. So sometimes even using that arbitrariness can kind of help you out in a sense. Because there's been times where I've been like beating something when it's already been done. I've been beating it and not really getting anywhere. And sometimes, as frustrating as it may be, arbitrariness of, let's say, school, for example, really helps the process out along. Like maybe I actually needed to take a break on this painting and then come back to it later. And having an upcoming critique, as much as I don't like them, really kind of gives you that kind of pause you need at times to kind of come back to a different piece or visit a different idea. And yeah, I found arbitrary pauses annoying, but they've been beneficial when you kind of work with them.
It seems like much of your practice is performance, really. And in so many spaces and really in reality, performance exists in temporality, in the ephemeral. And so how do you make sure that you hold on to these moments, hold on to your memory of how things could have been? Is there an ideal that you hold on to?
An ideal. I don't think necessarily there's an ideal. I gotta think about that for a little bit. For me,
because artists have that pre-imagined kind of ideal, but it seems that you don't stop. It seems you don't turn off that mind. How do you know when something is done and it's ready to be memorized, remembered?
Yeah, again, I do think it's a difficult thing to really answer. What I find myself at different times of work is I am really chasing a real visceral kind of emotional thing in the studio, and there are senses of satisfaction I have when I look at work.
Mm-hmm.
And I ask myself sometimes, not consciously or verbally, but I kind of stop sometimes and look at the work, and which I think it's been really my biggest engagement with abstraction is like, how do I feel about a thing when I'm looking at it? When I think back to the time we spent together, like, how am I feeling right now? And sometimes there's a deep emptiness that really kind of pushes my practice along forward. I'm kind of propelled forward until I kind of feel something that's really kind of, it's almost useless to describe other than a satisfaction. But there's something else to it that I haven't really put my finger on. But it's like, I feel like something has happened. And it makes me feel like there's been a cementing almost of the time that I've spent, the things that I've learned between me and this object. And that's really what kind of guides me, other than that kind of arbitrary, those arbitrary time and pauses. Am I feeling satisfied with what I'm doing right now? And if I don't, then, I'm anxious and eager to kind of continue doing it. But when I'm starting to feel that sense of, oh, okay, I'm seeing the things that I'm learning really solidify. I'm seeing the times and like the history markers and my hand in this piece really solidify into something. Then I feel that satisfaction more. And there's always more that I want to do to a thing. But when I'm starting to feel that, my time really in history with an object really solidify into something that, one, I think looks great and gives me a satisfaction, it gives me pause to kind of turn my attention to another body of work, or think about something else, or go look for more new materials, things of that nature. So yeah, it's not necessarily a completeness or a doneness, but it's does this represent something for my practice? It's like a vague completeness, like a vague doneness. Like, does this show what I want it to show? Yeah, I think that's kind of how I go about it.
I like that. For the next portion of our conversation, I want to talk about abstraction as it relates to the world and culture. Black art is always the revolution. It's always the consciousness and the next step of where the world is going. In the same quote that I quoted earlier, You said abstraction lies outside of the bounds of the identifiable and mimetic, by which the sentiment and concepts being communicated hold greater importance than the presence of the recognizable aspects in the work. How do you feel about the undeniable parts of how your jewelry, your accessory exists on bodies? I think it's interesting first to think about what metal what metal looks like on black bodies, and what our relationship to metal on our bodies has been in the past. How do you kind of reconcile that history with the contemporary kind of message that you're having through your catharsis?
I think in some senses, with my practice, there is a sort of immediateness of my work. What it feels like to respond and make a thing in the now is sort of not necessarily dwelling or reflecting a lot on things that have happened before. And I find myself kind of looking back at prior work and even kind of new work in terms of kind of forms and messages. I don't necessarily think I'm making anything groundbreaking or new. They're just kind of things that are spoken through my specific lens. You know, they're forms and ideas and thoughts that kind of happened already. When I think of people and their engagement with history, I do think sometimes that there's a thought that kind of looking back sometimes is a necessary first step in terms of making work. And honestly, I haven't really always had that same engagement. I do think there needs to be a more sense of the production of now, and admittedly, that could be a bit of being blind and kind of really feeling your existence in the moment and what that kind of propels you to think about work. Not that necessarily saying it's bad to look backwards or think about things in terms of how they play in a line of history. I just haven't found myself wanting to do that very many times. My engagement with abstraction really tries to kind of, as much as it can, because I honestly don't think this is possible really, but it tries to really avoid outside influences as much as possible in an attempt of trying to pull what feels to be a more authentic sense of self. And I find myself wanting to avoid looking at things currently and things that have happened in the past as an attempt to try to pull what feels to be a more interesting or authentic means of identifying present. And for better or for worse, that's where I find myself at most times, is really trying to, pull forward what it is that I'm embodying right now, what is them thinking right now, and having to make forms that I feel reflect that sense of presentness. That's just what I found myself doing.
Yeah. I think I've said it before, and I think you're kind of echoing the same sentiment, is our futurism and our creation of the future is utterly dependent on our consciousness and our living in our bodies. I think as an artist who I say in my artist statement, so much of my work is memory and thinking about our past. I come from the only state that was not a free or a slave state. It was simply don't come here. And we still came here. And so I have to think about that because we were banned up until 2001 and I was born in 2001. And so it was in their constitution for me to not be here. And so I always had to have that interaction with the past, with archaic ideas, with things that might not even be relevant, but still find themselves in our DNA. I want to say also that engagement is revolutionary also because so many generations of us couldn't be conscious in our own bodies. We couldn't be fully human. And so what I love about your interaction with your medium, but also your interaction with the medium and the bodies and the spaces, is that you take complete control of what is there. And that in itself is a revolutionary act if you can recognize that. something that might not have existed before you. If you understand that, you might be the first person in your lineage to be able to have that kind of control, not only within your mind and between your two ears, but also communally, spatially, right? Yeah. And so history, I believe, informs us, but it is up to us to create the new consciousness and always be up to what's happening in front of us. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really important, what you just said, really. I found myself really kind of being turned off at sort of senses of projecting of a future that, I don't know how I say this without really sounding condescending, but there's a lot that I've noticed in kind of work and media of projecting of a fanciful future, or like really kind of pushing forward or really digging back. So we're either really digging things that have happened already and are said and done, or we're projecting this imaginary future that we want to be, while kind of not noticing that the future's happening every day. There's always something that we're contributing simply by existing at this time now, in terms of propelling culture forward. Every person existing now is a part of culture. And the ideas of the past and wanting to preserve those things are all value and efforts. But if your engagement, when someone looks back at your time now, is simply looking back, I believe there can be something lost instead of projecting forward while you exist now. So I found myself not kind of wanting to, exist in a paradigm of always thinking about a now that, or thinking about a future that doesn't exist, or thinking about a past that's already happened, while we, exist in the now, and we're, creating history every single day. I feel like there should be a more engagement of the present. So that's kind of how I found myself thinking about, that kind of push and pull between futurism and, historical engagements. I feel like there's a medium in simply existing now and putting an emphasis in that as well. Like I don't think, there should be a hierarchy in any of these ways of engaging with the world or art.
What other art is inspiring you right now? What other things are happening that are really catching your eye?
I think there's a lot going on in terms of labels are a strange thing, but what seems to be still labeled as a more craft movement, I would love a better word for it, because I think there's a lot more going on, but I found myself always finding some kind of new work that just seems to really remind me why I want to be an artist. Some kind of handmade object. Yeah, there's times when I'm really kind of frustrated, and I ask myself, why am I making work? And ideas of a specific success aren't currently here. And I see like a really great work online, and I'm like, oh, okay, this is why I like making work. I see things going on with jewelry making, woodworking. I've really found myself these days kind of energized by seeing handmade work, and whether that be traditional techniques or people blending traditional with their interpretations of those traditional techniques and kind of pulling them forward. Yeah, really finding handmade and kind of craftsmen and craftswomen's work to really kind of bring me forward a lot.
Yeah. I think understanding humanity behind the work is very crucial right now. In the age of AI and the age of kind of automatic creation, understanding that a human created this took time, took thought, had other influences to create this thing. I think that's a very precious thing right now. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think about that as well. Just with the speed of technology, I think people kind of undersell how fast, we're developing things. Like I remember the very first initial steps of AI and how very janky and kind of crazy it looked. And now seeing things on the internet and not being able to, know if that's something made, through the lens of a human person. So I don't want to be too kind of doomer or raise too many of alarms. I think that technology has been at a pace that will far kind of outlast us in a sense, or will kind of push us to think about things that seem very sci-fi or, fantastical. And I think to kind of pretend that it won't happen within our lifetimes or within the next generation's lifetimes might be a mistake. And the more we kind of think about these things now and kind of talk about, how do we exist in what feels like a movie or a fiction, could be right around the corner. And it's not to kind of think about these things in despair, but it's just, the more we equip ourselves to think about a different future, the more we're able to handle it. I think if people thought more about, what's normal to you and I now is, cell phones and the internet. And I think if we went back, 20 to 30 or 50 years, the way that we think about how these things have kind of shaped our lives currently and the kind of issues that we're having would seem very kind of crazy and like out of a a horror sci-fi book. And these are real things that are happening now. People are alone. People don't spend the entire day not speaking to anybody. Yeah, they can be connected to the entire world once they open up their phone and look at it. So it's a very strange thing that if we don't kind of project forward in a way to what may seem very far off in the future, when it actually happens and we're experiencing it, we won't have, the sentiment and the tools to kind of get ahead of it now. So when I think about how fast I see AI developing in terms of kind of art, I simply say, well, we need more people making things. We need more people making physical things. And the idea of a person making a thing will become valued more than the idea of an AI making something better than a human or more like a human could. We had hand hammered mugs by metalsmiths and artists and artisans that went to a factory making faux handmade marks on mugs and producing people buying it for the sense of this looks like a handmade mug, but it's not. And it's cheaper and I can get more of them. I can replace them. I don't have to pay the price of an artisan. All we simply have to do is just change our perspective and, go buy the artisan handmade mug, go and invest more in ceramics, buy a painting by a real person, support art more.
So yeah, for people who aren't artists, how can they support the future of art?
Go to a show.
Yeah.
I don't think it's very difficult to kind of start or get a foot into the art world. There are things that you won't like and you shouldn't feel bad about it. I feel like a lot of things can't be art and it doesn't mean it has to be good to you. So if you go to a show and you don't like anything there, go to another show. There's going to be something out there that you're going to like. If you're more wealthy than the average person, buy work, Don't necessarily think of art as just this vehicle of storing and transferring wealth, but look into things that you want to own in a home. Purchase work from emerging or established artists and kind of really feed into the ecosystem in that sense. Share work. If you see something that looks good, show it to somebody else. I think there's very simple ways that we can think about art and support it that don't necessarily are out of our reach. And there isn't necessarily as big of a barrier of entry that people think who aren't in art. They just kind of haven't had the opportunity to really step into it in a way that feels comfortable for them. So, seeing very far off performance work online and seeing videos of people making fun of it, it might turn them off to work made in that sense. And it's okay to not understand it or not like it, but I think it's a misstep to think that's all that's happening right now in art, or to think that you've understood the entirety of that artist may have been doing in a piece that simply looks like a screaming performance. Maybe there's more that you can learn by kind of going to their website, reading a statement, listening to a podcast about people explaining art. Like there's so many different things that we can do to kind of, really support and reinvigorate an art scene in the States that I feel it's in a kind of precarious state right now, more than most people would like to admit. And it's going to take renewed public interest in the arts to keep it going direction.
One kind of interesting question. What do you think is driving that kind of, I don't know, what do you want to call it? Fear? Kind of, as an artist, I would call it complacency, that kind of lack of engagement with the critical mind that is required with art. It seems like people don't really even want to enter spaces to interact with art because they're scared of that kind of affect, maybe, right? What do you think the root of that is?
There's many potential causes. One that I think I've identified is just people think that there's a larger gap between artists and artwork and people who don't practice. And I think that's not the case. I think most people can think about art and critically engage with art way more than they might think. And that's kind of due to a lot of sense of, I think academia is a big part of it. And the kind of arts that they've produced and the work that they've been making kind of make people feel like they're very far away from understanding work. And the work that's being made has kind of been being made for artists, if I can say it that bluntly. Like, there's things that I see and I don't understand. Who else would be able to engage with it other than someone who's been reading theory or understanding all this lineage of art or kind of thinking about things in that sense? And not to knock it, but that's not the work I'm interested in making or seeing out in the world. I want a larger public to be able to see a work being made, and they won't necessarily understand all of it, but they can have a specific engagement to it relative to their level of understanding or engagement in work. So I just think there needs to be more work made to capture different segments of the population rather than work made purely out of academic theory in a way. I think there's a lot of
accessibility is important. Yeah.
100%. Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. Thank you. Accessibility. I think when I think about that kind of craft work that's really been invigorating me, I don't think it takes a lot to engage with something that looks good. It doesn't necessarily make that work more simple, but there is a step that's easier for an outside person to come in and look at an object and be like, hey, that looks good. And then they go and read an artist statement on the wall. And then they have a whole different dimension to what they're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's thinking about your work out in the world a bit more could really help out people's engagement with art.
What can the world expect next for you? What's going on?
I'm not where I want to be currently, but I'm still making work. So, if anything, plan on seeing more work from me and me seeing how I find myself navigating this art space and what that means. And trying to develop a relationship where the majority of what I'm doing is related to art. That is a dream future that I'm trying to make my way towards, is having art being kind of the main way I spend my time. And whether or not I can make that happen or what sense that kind of develops is to be seen, but that's what I'm looking forward towards, is having a more arts-related future than I do right now. So, but definitely more work. You see me online, I'll be trying to post more work.
So how can people stay in tune with your journey?
Yeah, I mean, I'm active on Instagram, for better or for worse. I'll be trying to post more in progress things, trying to update my website. I'm available for email, direct message, those kind of things. So I try to keep foot in the digital world as much as possible. I think there's a lot of utility there, and there's things that I don't like, but there's a lot of things that I do like. So being able to share work instantly, globally, I think is a real great utility. And despite all the other problems the platform has, I think it's a great plus, and I'll continue to utilize that.
Is there anything else you'd like us to know? Any words for the people?
Any words for the people? make more things. I like seeing good things in the world, and I want more people making stuff that I'd like to see that inspires me. If you're hesitant about how you feel about making work, or if you feel like there's some sort of barrier to being an artist, I want you to kind of try to dissolve that. And there's probably something interesting that you have to contribute to the lexicon of the art world and art making. And it would be a shame if you didn't contribute that due to some kind of preconceived notion of like what is making work and what is valuable. So yeah, I would like to see more artists in the near future. And no matter how you think that to be related to you, I'd like to see more people making work.
I love that. All right. I want to take a moment to once again thank everyone who supports this podcast. You can go to beacons.ai/HAKIM MIKAH if you'd like to support my future conversations.